Today's speaker is Vlad Bunea, a fellow compatriot Romanian and a new associate member of CACOR, whom I met last October through the CACOR-sponsored event with Toronto's York University environmental team. Vlad is a researcher with a Degrowth Research Circle at York University. He's also an editor of the Sufficiency and Wellbeing magazine, a founding member of Degrowth Collective, a founding member of the International Degrowth Network, and a Post-Growth Institute affiliate fellow. Vlad is working on a causal scripted analytical model for understanding economic behavior under capitalism. And now, without further ado, I will let Vlad take over. Vlad.
Thank you, Gabriela. And thank you for having me at CACOR. I am excited to be here, particularly because Degrowth is a child of the Limits to Growth report that was published by the Club of Rome back in 1972. Fast forward 54 years, we are in a position of monumental and existential importance for degrowth as a proposed solution for solving the environmental crises, but also many of our social, economic, and political crises. There are overwhelming reports that global warming of 2 degrees Celsius above industrial levels and more can cause catastrophic consequences for organized society and enormous economic losses in the trillions of dollars. There's also overwhelming evidence that economic expansion is directly linked with environmental degradation. We as a society have grown economically beyond the capacity of Earth to sustain the regeneration of life. Therefore, I argue, the degrowth of our economy must move to the center of political discourse. In this talk, I will aim to answer 5 quantitative questions and 5 qualitative questions about degrowth. I will end by going through 5 prefigurative statements that may inspire your thinking about the next steps in a degrowth transition. The degrowth literature is already vast, and I cannot review it here in its entirety. With the 10 questions, I will aim to touch on some of the most sensitive and radical positions within degrowth, which I think can drive the design of most effective policy instruments that can get us out of the crisis. There are many more questions that can be asked regarding the definition of degrowth or why to choose certain policy instruments over others. I believe these questions can be part of a wide conversation in Canada. Quantitative question number 1 is, how popular is degrowth? This survey on populations from the United Kingdom and the United States, published in 2025, has assessed public support for degrowth in comparison with concepts such as eco-modernism, eco-socialism, well-being economy, green capitalism, green growth, green market economy, and post-growth. In the first study presented in the paper, the results show that 81% in the UK support a full degrowth proposal without the word degrowth being used, compared to 73% in the United States. 10% are against the proposal in the UK, compared to 16% against in the US. When people are presented just with the labels, without any description, the numbers change. Degrowth performs the worst at 26% support in the UK, compared to 28% in the US, while the most popular label, again without any description of what it means, is well-being economy at 81% support in the UK, compared to 73% support in the US. The concept of post-growth performs better than degrowth, reaching 42% support in the UK, label only and no description, compared to 41% support in the US. This begs the question, what is different about the word post-growth that makes it better than degrowth. What happens when we offer people a description of the concepts? In the second study from the paper, degrowth was presented against eco-socialism and well-being economy. Without any description of the concept, degrowth jumps to 64% in the UK, where it becomes the most popular of the three, compared to 56% in the US, where it lands in second place at 1% behind well-being economy. When the full proposal is presented in addition to the label, the degrowth proposal under the well-being economy label scores the highest at 84% in the UK compared to 72% in the US. When degrowth is presented with the degrowth label, the support is 74% in the UK compared to 68% in the US. Same proposal, different labels. These studies illustrate perfectly the so-called dilemma of growth. People like degrowth proposal, but just they don't like the word degrowth as much. It is rather amusing, in my opinion, when we observe that these studies can be interpreted in this way, or quite to the contrary, as very powerful evidence that people actually like both the word degrowth and its proposals, under the condition that the proper explanation is required of what degrowth actually is before people can fully embrace it. This should not be a surprise because any new concepts follow the same fate. Even non-jargon policy ideas, such as free public transportation, require proper description to be fully understood and accepted. Degrowth is in no way any different. When the announcement came out in 2025 that the seventh planetary boundary was breached, which is ocean acidification, David Suzuki declared in an interview that the fight against climate change is lost. While in public, David Suzuki rarely took a position to challenge the status quo of capitalism directly and openly. In private conversations, some of which I have attended, he has been a fierce critic of the capitalist mode of production that has led directly to the environmental crisis. The degrowth response to the overshoot problem is nuanced and well researched. Several studies, such as this one, have shown both direct correlation and direct causation between the growth of the economy and environmental impact. The red lines in this paper from 2025 indicate the baseline for biophysical boundaries and social thresholds. Of course, zero boundaries should be crossed, and as many social thresholds should be met, which makes the top left corner the ideal place to be for all countries. No countries are in this ideal place. Overall, probably countries such as Costa Rica or Trinidad and Tobago seem to be on the right vector. Canada is farther away from the ideal on the biophysical axis. The response of degrowth to the overshoot problem comes wrapped under different packages. This one from the same paper uses post-growth as label. We may think that the authors stay away from the degrowth label out of caution to appear as little as confrontational as possible. But if we look at the proposal itself, it is as radical as it can get. If we take just the maximum income proposal that is highlighted here, we may think that even generic socialism is a soft, moderate position in comparison. The authors of the paper include Jason Hickel, Tim Jackson, Peter Victor, Kate Rayworth, who each chose different vocabularies in their work when they advocate for alternatives to capitalism. Quantitative question number 3 is how degrowth relates to unequal exchange in global North, global South relations. Unequal exchange results in large net flows of resources from the South to the North each year, which are mostly embodied in manufactured goods and services. From 1990 to 2020, the North has net appropriated 7.3 billion tons of embodied raw materials, 113 exajoules of embodied energy, 427 million hectares of embodied land, and 323 million person years per year of work. Just in the year 2022, in monetary terms, when productivity gaps are included, the gains for the global North rise to $8.8 trillion, while the global South lost $6.9 trillion. In other words, the average person in the global North, children and other dependents included, saved between $213 US and $603 per month thanks to unequal exchange and excluding or including productivity gaps. The average person in the global South missed out on an additional 35 to 145 US dollars per month, which is a considerable amount considering the dollar's purchasing power in the global South. The short answer to this injustice, from a degrowth perspective, is that it needs to stop immediately. How to stop the injustice of unequal exchange? A strong case can be made that present-day unequal exchange is nothing less than modern versions of imperialism and colonialism. Consumers and citizens in the global North are kept intentionally in informational blackouts about how their lifestyles are largely constructed on complex structures of extraction and exploitation. To add insults to injuries, these structures are coded into law that are strongly supported by institutions such as the OECD, the IMF, and the World Bank. More and more calls are being made for a delinking of the global South from the global North to happen, such as the Dakar Declaration from 2022 or research collections such as Delinking and Global Reparations that came out last year. The key point for degrowth is that removing the growth incentive also from the global South must be combined with the moral duty of the global North to pay up for its ethical share of resource extraction and unequal exchange. Degrowth seeks to remove the dependency on growth everywhere, while it builds alternative structures of development where a minority of humans do not live with excess consumption and production, while the majority world is kept underdeveloped on purpose. Moving to quantitative question number 4, which is how does degrowth respond to wealth and income inequality? One recent Oxfam Canada report shows that the top 0.01% of wealth holders in Canada is made up of approximately 1,800 families that hold more than 5% of all wealth in Canada, totaling nearly $800 billion. The top 0.1% of wealth holders in Canada hold more than 11% of all wealth in Canada. Their combined net worth is more than $1.8 trillion. The top 0.5% of wealth holders in Canada hold almost 20% of all wealth. To fall within this group requires a net worth of almost $12 million. Degrowth recognizes that pre-distribution policies such as inheritance tax or redistributive policies such as steep progressive taxation may not be good enough to fix this injustice. The design of the economic system itself must be changed in order to stop this madness. As I show in my own research and analysis of capitalism, the causal design of capitalism links property to power in proportion. The more wealth one possesses, the more social and political power. Degrowth seeks to phase out this unjust design. As it is already widely recognized, unfettered financial contributions to political campaigns by individuals and corporations lead to the election of politicians that are captured by private interests. While we have a much better regulation of political contributions in Canada than in the United States, we still live with a political system where wealth can buy power or access to power. The Office of the Commission of Lobbying of Canada, in their latest published report, counted 3,702 organizations and corporations engaged in lobbying in 2024-25 and 8,884 individual lobbyists. How much lobbying can a working class family buy for themselves? How can anyone on median income ever afford to put aside time or money to run for political office? Quantitative question number 5, how does degrowth relate to rationing? Research shows that 40% of humans live at levels of sufficiency. 32% are struggling. 29% are either consuming, over-consuming, or are being ultra-rich, ultra-consuming. In other words, 29% of all humans are above sufficiency and 32% are below sufficiency levels. The idea of rationing may appear a sensitive topic when people do not recognize a state of emergency. We have seen during COVID that rationing was widely accepted considering the circumstances. Even today, we can see how some stores limit the number of certain items that can be purchased. That is rationing. Sufficiency is living with just enough stuff. Sufficiency may be seen as a form of rationing, and even the opposite is true, rationing as a form of sufficiency. Rationing is a form of sufficiency or a method to balance needs, wants, and their satisfiers. The idea of rationing is not new. We had rationing of resources during World War II. I lived myself with rationing of certain basic foods in Romania in the 1980s. Here you can see a ration card for bread. The allocated amount was more than enough to cover nutritional needs. When it comes to the CO2 emissions of today, a table of rationing may look like this, where we see how much the consuming, over-consuming, and ultra-rich classes would need to degrow the consumption in order to reach levels of sufficiency. Air travel and private car use must be reduced by a minimum of 75%. Meat consumption must be reduced by 50 to 90%. At the same time, this degrowth unlocks resources such as land for agroecology for the struggling class to meet their nutritional requirements. As Stan Cox has put it, in any way we slice the problem, whether we call it rationing or sufficiency or enoughness, excesses in production and consumption must be rapidly eliminated. Let us now turn to qualitative questions. Qualitative question number 1 is, how is degrowth actually perceived? In 2023, the Beyond Growth Conference at the European Parliament talked a lot about the economic growth paradigm and its problems, but used the word degrowth very little. The general trend was to use post-growth instead, or even beyond growth, as the name of the conference suggested. Meanwhile, conferences led by activists and academics, such as the 6th International Assembly of the degrowth movement have no problems leading with the word degrowth. In this picture, you can see a small number of degrowthers in Oslo in 2025 out of a much larger group of active supporters. Typically, the perception of degrowth from outside the movement has to do with the alleged negative connotation, namely that degrowth means austerity or a less affluent life. Other perceptions and critiques refer to the technicality of the degrowth literature that is not accessible by the masses or that it does not translate into easy language. Other critics claim with a lot of certainty that degrowth is not politically feasible, that no politician could get elected if they ran on a degrowth platform. I claim it is a lazy position to dismiss degrowth only on the perception that it sounds negative because it suggests some version of austerity. Once we really unpack what the degrowth is proposing, we quickly realize that austerity is the opposite of what degrowth is proposing. We can use the metrics of sufficiency, as we have seen, to describe a degrowth transition. At the same time, the quality of degrowth is much more meaningful because it puts forward an ethic of emancipation from growth and towards social and global justice. Some rejections or reluctance to degrowth are actually sustained by hypocrisy, in my opinion. It is what economists Kevin Simler and Robin Hanson called hidden motives. The elephant metaphor was inspiration for the title of this talk. Obviously, degrowth wants to dismantle the capitalist status quo with all its successes and inequalities. This does not make everyone in the consuming and over-consuming classes very happy. Most humans in these classes want to keep their fancy mansions, many cars, and private jets. Unlike many competing concepts that offer alternatives to capitalism, degrowth is at least very honest about its intentions. A very well-researched paper by Lorenz Kaiser and team has identified no less than 112 mechanisms that generate growth dependencies and imperatives. They are sorted in 21 clusters, which you can see here. Qualitative question number 2 is, therefore, how does degrowth respond to these growth dependencies and incentives? This is a historical opportunity to let degrowth shine in all its positive glory. Undoing and phasing out growth dependencies and incentives is the core mission of degrowth, and we can argue this is why we have the word degrowth in the first place. It is about exercising the cancerous dependency on economic growth. And that's a very positive thing. We can be honest about it. We can show courage in expressing our credence in this solution. Degrowth responds with more than 500 policy instruments that address each of the 112 GDI mechanisms. Some of these instruments are universal basic income, universal basic services, reduction on working time, job guarantees, maximum income caps, not-for-profit cooperatives, rationing of resource use, and much, much more. I would like to emphasize that degrowth does not offer single silver bullets. The polycrisis requires a package of policy instruments that can work only if they're applied in coordination. The GDIs we see here operate with codependencies, contradictions, overlapping causal mechanisms that cannot be shaken and be phased out with single item policies. In my own research, I argue that a causal suprastructure exists which gives birth to this canvas of growth, dependencies, and incentives. Degrowth is the only framework that is suited to challenge this superstructure, which I will briefly unpack soon. Qualitative question number 3 asks, is degrowth about changing lifestyles or changing the system? The short answer is yes. Degrowth is about changing lifestyles and is also about changing the system. There are very passionate debates within the degrowth movement about the right approach. Some authors, such as Ted Trainer, advocate for adopting simple living. Ted Trainer calls it the simpler way. This is about living with sufficiency right now by rejecting the entire consumerist culture. It is an attempt to make capitalism obsolete by creating an alternative in the present. Other approaches that consider the legacy of colonialism think that we must take political power and enact change from the top down. In the top-down versus bottom-up debate, I take both approaches and I advocate for what is known as dual strategy. Basically, it says, if you can afford to quit capitalism, do it. If you cannot afford it, live as close as you can to sufficiency and join networks of solidarity and action. If taken separately, just changing lifestyles on a mass scale is not good enough and cannot be done, actually. The forces of capitalism are too powerful to allow all of us to escape them. At the same time, taking power, even if it happens, may be eroded by political opposition and electoral cycles. If we get, let's say, universal basic income or even universal basic services tomorrow by some wise government intervention, there is no guarantee that it is done in such a way that our dependency on economic growth is canceled. For this reason, degrowth must become a widely known and accepted concept. However, degrowth is not alone in the market of ideas. We have competing concepts such as post-growth, well-being economics, circular economy, donut economics. They each look at the problem of economic growth from different angles and adopt particular vocabularies. Some of these ideas do not like to say cancer, but they say opportunity for remission instead. They don't say emergency room, they say the well-being preparation room. Some of these ideas make significant effort, which often comes across as ridiculous, to avoid talking about the elephant in the room or to appear confrontational or contrarian. They do acknowledge the elephant, but they give it different names. They, they often claim that the reason is not the elephant itself, but rather something that the elephant does that causes havoc. If we just tamed the elephant or kindly offered another room for it to be in, we'll just be fine. The elephant is just this cause that is, of course, capitalism. Some authors have called for a separation of degrowth from these narratives because the business of degrowth is to name the elephant, talk about its bad behavior, and remove it from the room before it tramples on everything. This is a wild elephant. It cannot be tamed or reasoned with. As a degrowther myself who enjoys walking on a tightrope, I would like to place a friendly challenge to the so-called competition. How do you propose we phase out all wealth above $5 million and expropriate the super rich without compensation? How do you propose we reduce the ecological footprint in Canada and expropriate fossil fuel companies? How do you propose we eliminate unjust debt in the global south and pay them reparations? And how do we democratize the economy? I will briefly bring up my own research in relation to degrowth. I mentioned earlier that I think there's a causal superstructure that is responsible for the growth dependencies and incentives, but also more generally for how economic agents behave under capitalism specifically. This causal structure is based on the doctrines, or sometimes I call them forces, of proportionality, hierarchies, and dispossession that act as bridges between the realms of property, power, and capital. Growth is sitting in the middle as a catalyst for economic behavior. These three doctrines or forces are hard-coded into law and various operational scripts, such as contracts, algorithms, corporate memos, that are a de facto fundamental causal source for economic behavior that is specific to capitalism. In my upcoming doctoral research at York University, I will fully unpack this model. Degrowth holds a unique position vis-a-vis this causal scripted model because it offers precisely the right approach and instruments that can phase out capitalism, including growth incentives and dependencies, at their causal source. I think it is super important to look at the design of our economic system from a causal perspective, to go beyond descriptions and interpretations. In the last part of my talk, I will aim to look at the future in the form of 5 prefigurative statements. The first prefigurative statement is that we should normalize the ethics of limits. The entire narrative of the status quo is to defend the causal superstructure of capitalism. Owners of capital, think tanks, mainstream media, elected politicians, agents of the state promote aggressively this design. The counteroffensive can start, and should start, in my opinion, with the forceful promotion of the ethics of limits. Philosophers such as Ingrid Robbins are offering the conceptual moral framework for limits on wealth and income. For example, in practical terms, individuals can internalize this ethic by themselves if they are in a cultural or in an intellectual position to do so. Given that a 1 to 7 maximum personal income ratio is a desirable outcome in society, according to some surveys, such as this one, with the maximum income being 7 times as much as the lowest income, people should stop seeking any more increases in income or wealth once they reach that maximum limit. In Canada, that is roughly $258,000 per year. If you make more than that, it is already too much, according to a libertarian ethic. When it comes to wealth, I argue, in line with Ingrid Robbins, $5 million should be a maximum limit based on the fact that this amount is the threshold for belonging to the top 1%. Super rich people who internalize this ethic and have excess wealth should simply donate all their wealth above the limit and should refrain from seeking more wealth and accumulation. Breaking party politics, considering our existential crisis, seems a very difficult task. To address this problem, I think we should normalize the ethics of many forms of democracy, such as sortition and sociocracy. We should learn them, promote them, and use them as much as possible. I used to support proportional representation as a fix to our broken electoral system. I don't support it anymore. Proportional representation is not good enough. It does not get rid of corruption and roadblocks. Political elections should be abolished completely and replaced with legislature by lottery. I sometimes talk also about qualified random selections, which allows the introduction of some variables to the lottery. This image shows the model of, of a legislature with 6 bodies proposed by Terry Boricius. It incorporates many checks and balances, allows space for expert input, and separates writing policy from the voting process. Sociocracy, on the other hand, is a method for organizing institutions in a decentralized fashion where decisions are made based on consent as opposed to consensus. Sociocracy, for example, is the governance used by the International Degrowth Network, which I helped co-create. Citizen assemblies are the perfect example of how sortition works in practice. I think we should have as many assemblies as we can with decentralized decision-making to tackle the problems of our society. While we consider an experiment with new forms of democracy, we should be honest about colonial and imperial legacy. The Environmental Justice Atlas counts 354 cases, last time I checked, in which Canadian companies are engaged in some sort of environmental injustice. This map shows that Canada engages in exploitative practices both at home and abroad, determined by the causal superstructure of capitalism. Nobody is immune to the design of capitalism, and we should not be afraid to recognize this reality. We cannot move forward as a society if we do not sanction these corporations for their nefarious activities. Of course, more fossil fuel pipelines in Canada and abroad are really a bad idea. The stubbornness of the Alberta government with which they defend their status quo comes with the same growth incentives and dependencies that we are familiar with. The federal government must recognize these growth incentives and dependencies and respond to the Alberta government with degrowth policy instruments. In my opinion, nothing else can unblock this gridlock. Fossil fuels must go, but workers in Alberta cannot lose their jobs and pensions at the same time. A job guarantee plus basic income, basic services, and other policy instruments can fix this. They must come as a package. At the same time, Canadian companies must retreat their exploitative practices from abroad and move away from capital accumulation. Measuring what really matters for the quality of life can also help with changing the obsessions with economic growth. We should normalize alternatives to growth dependencies and incentives. The WISE triangle from Leiden University shows dozens of metrics that can be used as alternative to GDP. Humans tend to measure what it matters to them, but so far GDP has been used as a proxy to measure illusions. We thought GDP was a good proxy for quality of life and the general health of the economy, but it led us astray. Growth of the GDP as a number for economic growth has become the core obsession of all politicians and economic agents. We forgot that GDP was supposed to be just a proxy, and we forget that it is a bad proxy. Often countries with lower GDP per capita, such as Costa Rica or Spain, are quoted as having a higher life satisfaction than Canada and the United States. Research shows that there's no significant correlation between a country's income growth and a growth in happiness. If this is the case, why are we stuck in chasing economic growth? Looking at the causal structure of capitalism provides the answer. When we are asking ourselves, what should we do about it, knowing that we have been looking in the wrong place to measure economic activity can be a good starting point to move public opinion into the right direction. Bhutan, for example, has a gross national happiness index. Bhutan has an ecological footprint of consumption of 4.37 global hectares per capita compared to Canada at 8.1 global hectares per capita. Haiti is at 0.48 global hectares per capita. Costa Rica is 2.5. The world target average is about 1.48. Something is gotta give. The rules, the laws, and the ethics for a new economy should be constructed collectively and democratically. As I mentioned, the beginning could be with a focus on popularizing and implementing ethics of sufficiency, which includes limits on income and wealth and rationing of resource use. To build legitimacy for such a massive project, we could start in Canada with rolling out nationwide citizen assemblies that can deliberate on the formation of such ethics of sufficiency while taking advice from experts and people around the world that are directly affected by how Canada conducts its business. In a massive United Nations survey that you can see here on climate from 2024, 62% of respondents from Canada said that rich countries should give more help to poorer countries to address climate change. 30% responded that Canada must replace fossil fuels quickly. 34% said somewhat quickly. The only way to do this equitably while not leaving anyone behind and lifting up 32% of the world population that is struggling below levels of sufficiency is with degrowth. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vlad, for a very thorough presentation on the topic. As today's facilitator, I'll take the opportunity to make my a quick remark, a very simple remark. Degrowth is fine as long as it doesn't affect me. So that's probably the answer of a lot of people. So what do we do with that? How do we get started?
Do you mean as a question for me, Gabriela?
Yeah.
Well, as I mentioned, I think starting with popularizing the ethics of sufficiency would be a good idea. So this involves a wide movement from a bottom-up grassroots activists and experts from a top-down strategy. I personally advocate for a dual strategy. So you find yourself in wherever you are in the right place and join the proper level of action. We had the International Degrowth Assembly 2 days ago, which is an assembly of activists where we talked about power mapping. What is the right approach for different levels of power structures in society to promote these ideas and how to address concerns from the global population? And as you have seen in the survey, perceptions are positive and reactions to policy instruments of degrowth are very supportive. So I'm hopeful that with the proper narratives, such as the one that we are attempting at our magazine, the Sufficiency and Wellbeing magazine, I encourage you to subscribe, by the way,
Okay.
is the way to experiment.
All right. Let's hope we can make some changes in the ethics and values. We have a few questions that showed up in the chat, and Claude Butner, please, if you can unmute yourself, and Charles Hall, please, after. Okay, Claude.
So, Vlad, thank you very much. I'll be watching this one again to glean more of the details. Very thorough and thought-provoking. And my question is, I'm going to ask you to speculate on what would be the symptoms of the beginning of degrowth that would let us know that the world economy has unfolded into this mode of operation, planned or not. And implied in my question is that I suspect that since we haven't been able to get ahead of the climate situation, emissions, temperatures, and CO2 all increasing after 50 years of supposedly being aware, I suspect that the same will happen with degrowth, is that it's going to be imposed on us. And I would like you to speculate what would be the symptoms that would show up first.
Well, in my opinion, as I'm a supporter of a dual strategy, the top-down approach that you mentioned, Claude, would look like some of the policy instruments that I have alluded to. We might see universal basic income, basic services, free transit being adopted on a larger scale, a job guarantee, for example, work time reduction being adopted on a larger scale. All of these have been experimented with in smaller projects. So I would see a larger scale adoption of some of these instruments or a combination of many. On the flip side, on the bottom-up approach, we have seen some glimpses of a degrowth-like ethic during COVID, when people refrained from some habits of consumption. As degrowth advocates for a reduction in consumption and production on the consumption side, once this ethic of sufficiency expands and is adopted by more people, consumption patterns will shift away from environmental destructive products and towards more immaterial satisfier for needs. And that may happen sooner than expected, but we'll see about the global circumstances.
Thank you. If I could just add a quick follow-up rebuttal question.
Please.
What country anywhere in the world is closest to adopting a guaranteed minimum income?
Well, there have been many experiments. I've been a long-time follower of the UBI activism. There are several organizations in Canada. Canada themselves, we experimented on several occasions. It was the experiment in Manitoba in the 70s. More recently in Ontario, that was canceled before its deadline by the Ford government. There have been many experiments, India, from what I remember, in Africa, Kenya. At the national level, no country has adopted UBI on a national scale. I think modeling shows support for national scale implementations. I would guide you to a basic income literature to see the numbers for each country and the modeling. It is largely doable in Canada as well. There's an academic, Evelyne Forget, who published a book on UBI in Canada. She says that there's money to do a UBI in Canada at the minimum of roughly $1,600, a universal model that's per adult citizen, and then can be paid for, of course, with different budget designs and modern monetary interpretations of fiscality. I hope this answers the question.
It does. You're hopeful that it's going to develop somewhere, but yet no country seems to be ready to do it yet.
That is correct, yes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Charles, please, and Letitia, next. Please make your questions short. We do have quite a few people interested in asking questions, and we do have another about 40 minutes. Okay, Charles, go ahead.
Assume Canada, every single person running for office runs on a platform of more, as far as I can tell, and not less. So how do we have a democracy and degrowth together? So that's one question. The second question is, which I'm adding, is I saw Costa Rica was close to your desired goal, and certainly there's much that's good about Costa Rica. But I went down to Costa Rica when I was young and naive and studied it in great detail and wrote a whole bloody big thick book on Costa Rica, looking carefully at agriculture, at coffee, at bananas, at every single thing that Costa Rica was about. And found incredible petroleum intensity for every single thing in Costa Rica, and also their politician promised more. So if you look into the details of where energy is used, which is my thing, I can send this book to anybody who emails me. You just look at it in detail, and everything we do is so energy intensive. So it's very hard for me to understand when you look at things carefully, what the hell we can do in this modern world that isn't energy intensive, and whatever that means. Well, I'm a little bit discouraged myself.
So to answer in a hopeful note, I tend to be an optimist by nature, Charles. To your first question, how can we have democracy and degrowth? We cannot with the current model. So I happen to think that it's almost impossible to have a degrowth implementation with our current electoral democracy model, constructed largely on the Westminster model, that's also built on the Roman Empire model. But would be very likely if we got a party in power that would openly and widely adopt degrowth policy instruments. So this is why I advocate for, on the bottom-up approach, for citizen assemblies as a public forum where these ideas can be discussed, the ethics of sufficiency disseminated, taught, and adopted, which builds legitimacy for whoever is elected to implement and deploy degrowth policy instruments. And this is even before we think about reforming our electoral system. So my hope rests with the citizen assemblies and local, gatherings of activists and practitioners that can showcase how degrowth is being done. The International Degrowth Network has a lot of materials of businesses that already operate according to this logic, away from growth dependencies and incentives. Sure, they can be scaled up, but they do need a legislative framework to be supported. To the second question about Costa Rica, if you remember the second quantitative question that had all the countries on a slide, Costa Rica is also very far from the ideal. It has roughly 3 or 4 planetary boundaries that have been transgressed. No country is in the right position. It has only about 7 social thresholds that are met from 11, so about half. So Costa Rica is still following growth dependencies. It's not there. The narrative of elected officials may be quite different from what is being practiced in the civic sphere. So there's massive disconnect between the two spheres that is aggravated by the electoral system. I think these citizen assemblies can bridge the gap. They should happen soon, by whatever means necessary. A lot of conversations will have to happen. Elected officials have to be lobbied and invited to this forum. And these tough questions will have to be answered. How do we move away from growth dependencies and incentives? I hope this answers some of your concerns. I also must apologize for my voice. I'm recovering from a cold, so I may be losing my voice from time to time.
Why don't you talk about population degrowth more?
Can we excuse me for this, Charles? Okay, we'll let Vlad mention that maybe a little later, but right now we have Letitia. Could you please unmute yourself, and John Mayer on deck, please? Letitia? I guess she's not available right now. So John Mayer and then Raymond on deck.
Yeah, Charlie, here's your population issue coming in from the side. Aging is a natural degrowth driver. The population is going to stabilize and decline. And old people with an older age structure, old people just consume less. We don't need we don't have to have all new infrastructure, expanding infrastructure. Plus, one thing to say about boomers, it's not just the super rich who don't want to give up their comfort and their yachts. The boomers and everybody else, my Tim Hortons crowd, they don't want to give up their trucks, and everybody wants to cling to the level of consumption that they've got. However, I think everybody over the age of 50 recognizes that we've really screwed up and they're looking for alternatives. So they might be open to something like degrowth or that discussion anyway. But my question is, have you heard any talk of aging being a natural degrowth driver?
Well, there's a book that I quoted in one of the slides, edited by Tony Ruska. It's on sufficiency, and they tackle the population question in relation to sufficiency and degrowth. Population dynamics, including aging, does not come up as often in degrowth literature as we might think, but population dynamics does come up, not in the mainstream of degrowth literature. Most modeling has to do with production and consumption, and they look at the throughput and the ecological footprint numbers, not as much as how many people we have that share the limited resources. And it is a thorny question because it alludes to, Paul Ehrlich and those, nefarious ideas from the 60s and 70s with population controls that many degrowthers do not even want to touch. But some people are thinking about it. In my opinion, looking at the models, I don't think we can have a population decline, a natural decline, fast enough to bring us within planetary boundaries by
Agreed.
2050, as it's required by IPCC.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So
Okay.
that's why a planned degrowth is necessary.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks.
Thank you.
Gabriella, you're on mute.
Okay, thanks, Rebo. And Art on deck, please.
Hi, Vlad. My question is, I'll word it a bit differently than what I have in the chat there. So I've been working for over a decade now, trying to get people to adopt solutions that are better for the planet, things like heat pumps and EVs. And when I talk to them about that, and if ever I bring up the issue of the climate change impacts and all that, that doesn't influence them. Yet these are the same people who would say in a survey that, oh yeah, we should be reducing emissions, and oh yeah, we should be reducing consumption because the planet is in trouble. But when it comes down to taking real action, people say, well, no, why? What's in it for me, and they don't care about the overall community. So how do we overcome that?
Well, this is I would say, the number one topic that comes up to followers of the degrowth movement that are not necessarily engaged in some sort of a degrowth activism. So this question tends to come up from the Western Hemisphere. We happen to have in our network a lot of activists and scholars from the global South, and they look at this question, what's in it for me, in a different way. They recognize that the legacy of North-South relations, that it's built upon unequal exchange, place tremendous disadvantages on the southern side, which automatically builds a sort of a moral obligation for the global north to recognize their position of privilege, both in terms of lifestyles and in terms of the structural causal design of the system, which to some extent removes the onus from personal responsibility. And I think that's where the psychological shift happens when you extrapolate from individual responsibility and put the entire responsibility on the system. And in this sense, I think it's bad politics to shame lifestyles of the global north populations. However, at the same time, people can still be held accountable on an individual level and systemic level in the global north because of the consequences of their lifestyles. So in this sense, plus adding the ethics of sufficiency that I think must be discussed at the society level to build legitimacy, can break that psychological gridlock in which you think, what's in it for me? Let the other move first. I'm going to do my heat pump, but I'm still going to do my 2-year vacations overseas and burn I don't know how many miles flying or buying my second SUV. So it's a psychological shift that needs to happen, and it can only be done socially with ethics of sufficiency that are adopted through social conversations. And I'm hoping this is the beginning of these conversations, and they must happen far and wide, not just within Canada.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Remo. Art, and we have John Legg on deck, please.
Okay, this is follow up that with Raymond, of course. I I have discussed this very topic with a number of people over the last decade, and have arrived at a personal level that's ground up that says stop burning everything, and electrify your life. And so I'm rather interested in your opinion as to whether you would encourage geothermal energy. Would you encourage people to put solar arrays up? Would you encourage people to drive an EV and have home batteries? That sort of thing. Because I believe that if a person makes these investments, you end up, in fact, making money by not spending money on natural gas, on gasoline, on electricity. And I have put together, a presentation that says, let's stop talking about BTUs and kilowatt hours, and talk money. And people understand money. And when you say it's to your advantage, financial advantage, to stop burning, you get people to listen to you a little more. What's your comments on that?
Thank you, Art. Yes, so this question is very important, and it's being discussed quite often in literature and beyond. Yes, it makes sense to move away from anything that's related to fossil fuels. At the same time, it depends on where you live. It's still a position of privilege to live an electrical life. So not everyone can afford heat pumps and electrical cars and etc. The holistic approach of degrowth is to look at the entire material footprint of both consumption and production. As everyone knows in the audience and those watching, solar panels, EVs, tend to have a significant material footprint as well. What matters in the end is the entire product life cycle of what we use. So it is not enough to electrify our life. but also to decrease significantly the consumption of electricity and how many of these products we use. So there are a lot of numbers and research that look at this. I would guide you to the research done by Julia Steinberger on the numbers of what a sustainable degrowth-like lifestyle would look like in terms of energy consumption and material footprint. You'd be surprised that it's much, much less than what we have here on average in Canada. So that's just the beginning, and making a financial case for sufficiency, of course, I totally support it. It totally makes sense to decrease the overall material footprint, but it's not just limited to what kind of electricity one consumes. We must buy much less stuff in general, eat much less meat on average, fly much less. There's a whole list of things that can be done on an individual levels.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you, Art. So John Legg and Steve Rakidziowski on deck, please.
Can you hear me, Gabriella? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, John. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll fire ahead then. I think it's a courageous series of positions that you have taken, Vlad. I'm 87 years old, so if I use your first name, I say use my first name too. It's just that anyway, I see all sorts of good examples within CACOR. I mean, just recently, Art Hunter was talking about the things that he has tried to do, and he's done a big effort. And my wife's from Sweden, so she's used to the attempts at social democratic governments over there to change society. And it's really what you are doing. You're making attempts to change society. Well, I admire your courage. But there was one point I didn't quite catch, and that is you got into the small points of using the GDP as a factor in analyzing your attempts and our attempt to change society. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is, these are fine points that you're using, and changing society is not an easy thing to do. But can you give some things that I should have caught, which really went over my head on what's the weak point of using the GDP as a factor in our attempts to change society? There you are.
Thank you, John. So on the deep GDP question, GDP itself, invented by Simon Kuznets, the mid 20th century, has had its critics from the beginning, and more recently, degrowth has added a very powerful critique of GDP, largely around the fact that it does not measure what actually matters for a good quality of life. So, for example, as many know this analogy, a forest, while it's standing and providing air and good ecology, does not bring any measures to the GDP unless it is cut down and sold as timber. So GDP measures financial exchange on the market. It measures economic agitation. It does not measure free time, for example, that it's extremely valuable for the quality of our life. It does not measure trust and solidarity in society. It does not measure the importance and quality of water, of nature in general. So GDP as a metric of what has a price That means what's being sold, bought and sold within a year in an economy misses out of a lot of social life and economic.
Now,
Yes,
Vlad,
go ahead.
I apologize for interrupting, but
No worries, go ahead.
I see that. Okay, fine. What are you not using as a factor? The point is, we've got to cut through this one way or another. I mean, I take pride having sold our houses, or sorry, well, a townhouse about 10 years ago. We sold it, and we said, okay, we're not going to buy another house. We're going to put that in investments. Okay, and here I am. I've got my car is the big car. Right? We have two cars. I have a Honda Fit. My wife has a Honda Civic. That's the big car. Mine's the small car. So, you know, we've done valid things. And here I have my car. The Fit is an '08, 2008. My wife is the new one, 2009. We both go through the mess of oiling as an anti-rust measure. So we're doing our part. What are you missing? What can you do more?
Well,
Or what can we do more? I'm sorry, it's us.
yes, on a personal level, as I mentioned before, there's a limit to how much responsibility can be put on individual lifestyles. So there's a limit because not everyone can afford to live with sufficiency. For example, if you live in a rural area in Ontario, you cannot not have a car. Your life depends on it. Even if that car must be an SUV or a pickup truck so you can haul your daily necessities, there's just no way of living without that. So there's a limit. It depends. It depends very much on your personal circumstances. Only individuals can be the judges of their own circumstance. But I get the sense, John, that your heart is in the right place and you have done everything you can to play a role in this scheme. And I'm not sure how you invest your money, but probably, we have little control of where the money goes. But if you have some control, you might not want to invest in fossil fuel companies, but it depends. Not even there. I don't control where my pension goes. It's all bundled in mutual funds, and
Well,
who knows
okay.
where the money is.
Well, I admire your efforts, but we're obviously not cutting it. Okay, I mean, I've hogged enough time. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you,
No worries.
John. Thank you.
Thank you.
We can continue this conversation after the recording is
Right.
stopped. Okay. So thank you, John. Steve Rakidziowski, could you please unmute and ask your question? And Peter McKinnon on deck, please.
Yes.
Steve?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate the presentation, Vlad. I've been growing interest in degrowth and all the associated ideas for the last year to 2 years or so. And I guess what I struggle with as I'm learning more and more is how to relate to my neighbor, my family, my wife, my everybody, and have those conversations in a real way that seems practical. And I think part of what Art and um, Raymond and John, the conversation seems to be just, for those that are interested, it seems more so stay involved, learn more. You get more adept and fluent at being able to weave in some of the ideas in the day to day. I guess what I was maybe seeking is, are there resources out there that kind of break things down so that there's more relatable kind of discussions or points of view that you can usher into those conversations with your social circles? So it started out with a question, but it's I guess I'm answering my own question with just continue to participate, learn and read more. And yeah, I just appreciate the time taken to put together your ideas and thoughts here today.
Thank you, Steve. I have just shared a link in the chat to a very large database where we put together a lot of resources regarding degrowth, papers, books, podcasts, videos, you name it. So you can look at the database and pick your pace of learning and depth of learning. And there are also many organizations around the world that you can join to learn more, or also to do activism if you're interested.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Peter, you can ask your question, and Paul Beckwith is on deck.
Thank you, Gabriella. Also, Vlad, I really enjoyed your presentation. It certainly dovetails with some of my own proselytizing, I suppose, such as the planetary boundaries, planetary limits issues. But I posed a question in the chat regarding degrowth in respect to cities. We think of cities as sort of the nexus of civilization, and we are seeing cities basically are sweeping the people out of the countryside. So how do you see cities themselves, not even smart cities, but some of the larger cities in the world, for example? How do you see these being able to fit? How do they fit into your degrowth strategy?
Yes, so there's a literature on municipal degrowth as well. Cities tend to adopt the donut economic approach in towards planetary boundaries. There's been some literature looking at how Amsterdam or Barcelona are moving on the path of degrowth without using the word degrowth, by trying to adopt some versions of donut economics, with some success and some failures. There have been critiques of those approaches. The donut economics model can be easily co-opted because it leaves space for green growth and venture capitalists to deploy their investments, or pop up here and there and try to hijack the narrative and still operate under growth dependencies and incentives. Overall, I think cities play a tremendous role in a potential degrowth transition. Is the place where basic services can be, like a UBS agenda, can be implemented the easiest, because you have all the infrastructure in place. You just have to look at the fiscal and monetary design. Same with UBI, can be designed based on demographics and affordability. Canada has had some modeling for UBI, depending on the city. And in terms of energy consumption and self-provisioning, this varies widely depending on the size of the urban center. Most cities cannot be self-sufficient in terms of food provisioning. So degrowth is looking at alternative provisioning systems inspired by agroecology that can, feed cities. This is an ongoing conversation. La Via Campesina has had a lot of good work and activity on this. This is an international movement of farmers, and they have some solutions of how big cities can be fed in a transition with healthy food. Obviously, we have to move away from industrial agriculture so we can feed a city like Toronto. Yes, it's a very important topic.
Is this actually a theme in anything you've come across among the smart cities community?
Well, yes, and there's a dedicated research community that specifically looks at degrowth municipalism. We have a mailing list. So a lot of researchers, apologies, are looking at how cities can implement this with many examples. I can perhaps put it in the chat or email you later resources.
Certainly, if you have a link you can put in the chat, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much for
Okay.
your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
I enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks, Peter. Paul, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question. And after that, I will read some questions from Letizia because she was not available. And then we will end the recording session. Paul, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Great talk. I just want to talk a little bit about China. There's a great book by Dan Wang that was just published called Breakneck: China's Quest to Engineer the Future. And I think one of the key points is that China's an engineering state and the US is now a lawyerly state. So, the US could hardly build anything without years and years of red tape. Meanwhile, China's experienced, of course, exponential growth, as people know, but just some of the numbers are so startling. I just put a few in the comments. So going from 500,000 cars to 435 million cars from 1990 to 2024 in China. High-speed trains, tracks longer than the rest of the world combined. Subways, they added the equivalent in New York City, and in 10 years, 51 cities have subway lines, 11 are longer than New York City's subway lines. Ports, Shanghai moved more containers in 1 year, 2022, than all US ports combined. Nuclear plants, first one in 1991, now they have 55, more than the US. 31 are under construction. I think there might be, we might be upgrading one nuclear plant. The US is trying to do one, but it's red tape from the lawyers. Housing, urban, they're growing basically the equivalent of New York City plus Boston, urbanizing the people in cities every single year. But this most startling, cement, 4.4 billion tons from 2018 to 2019 produced in China. That's equal to the amount of cement the US produced over the entire 20th century. So, we can all talk about China, but unless you really understand how big the numbers are, this is the complete opposite of degrowth. But one thing is they're trying to electrify their entire society, and they're trying to achieve that by 2050. Okay, so they're completely opposite to degrowth, but they want clean growth, not fossil fuel burning growth. So can you comment a little bit on that? Because that's the reality of what's happening in the world, China. And what you're talking about is the complete opposite. So I don't see your scenario ever happening, unfortunately, unless there's a societal collapse. So maybe you can comment on those sort of things.
Yes,
thank you.
Paul.
I'm gonna mute. There is some background noise where I am.
Okay, thank you, Paul, for your question. Very important. I'm aware of China's position in this degrowth paradigm. China is in a very interesting position because they can be counted both as the global South recipient and global North exploiters, depending on how you look at the problem. No country, including China, is immune from the growth dependencies and incentives I mentioned. So in one of my slides, research by Lorenz Kaiser. So those dependencies, of course, they also apply to China. So the question becomes, okay, should we do degrowth here in the Western Hemisphere and wait for China to catch up or do their own degrowth first, or convince them to do degrowth first there and then we'll follow suit? This question came up in a debate I had 2 years ago at the University of Toronto. I don't think I have a different answer. I think we should focus on what we do here and internalize ethics of sufficiency regardless of what China is doing. Because if we wait for them to degrow first and never do it on our end, we're going to collapse much faster even if China doesn't do anything. So leading by example, I would say it's a good ethic that can be blended with sufficiency. There's also this notion of delinking that more and more happens in my conversations with the Global South scholars. There's a book in one of the slides I mentioned. And they also see China as one of the exploiters. They don't look kindly to China, even though China is not as militarist as the United States, but they do gobble up resources throughout the world. They do exploit cheap energy, cheap labor, and cheap land, much like any other capitalist enterprise. The delinking movement in Africa is growing. There's a bunch of countries have made agreements. Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, just a few examples. They're trying to resurrect some of the Samir Amin's vision from the 70s, where the South becomes delinked from the global North. But this time around, they're including China. So assuming they're successful, I don't know. I'm hoping that would mean China would be cut off to some extent from cheap resources in Africa. So if Africa nationalizes their resources, China will be faced with a conundrum. So they will have to reevaluate their position. Now there's issues with, okay, you can electrify China, but until you get there, you still depend on fossil fuels. They're not there yet. To electrify China, you still need a lot of resources, as you mentioned. Václav Smil has done research on this, like counting the materials that go into greenifying infrastructures. Simon Michaud has done some researches at the Geological Survey of Finland. We'll also look at China's infrastructure. So those numbers are right, Paul. It's not an easy question. And to sum up in conclusion, I think we should still do it here at home first.
Okay, I'd just like to add that, I think maybe a lot of the theory and techniques that you talk about in degrowth maybe could apply to a society rebuilding after a societal collapse. But basically, the direction the world is heading is exponential growth. There's nothing to do with degrowth. That's the reality, unfortunately.
I agree.
And, even if you talk about China population stabilizing or their growth, platforming, leveling, or even if their growth dropped in half over the next few decades, you still have to look back 30, 40 years and see how much growth there's already been. So it's not really a degrowth sort of idea. So I don't know if you work with survivalists and people that, talk about how do we rebuild a civilization if we actually collapse it, because I think that's probably more relevant to today's world than thinking of degrowth in the West.
I have days, Paul, thank you for this observation, when I fully embrace the collapse mindset. And I think, like David Suzuki said, it's too late, we lost, we should, get used to it. Let us prepare for what comes after. I think there's enough in the degrowth literature to offer us tools for resilience after the collapse. And even above the collapse, it may take many forms. You can count, for example, COVID as a mini collapse in which, energy consumption and consumption generally decreased by, 5-10%. That's like a degrowth demo by disaster, not design. Until we get there, my approach is to try everything we can on the design part, which I think hasn't been exhausted yet. Yes, I agree with you looking at the numbers, global warming, resource use, all of that are all going up. We should focus on both. I think there's intellectual energy to focus on both. But yeah, I think we should not lose hope right away. all of it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul, and thank you very much, Vlad.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Vlad, for this very interesting presentation. I joined just after it started, but it brings up a lot of things that we were talking back in, 15 years ago. There was a lot of movement in the degrowth area in Canada at the time, and I hadn't heard much about it since. So I feel you brought us up to speed on what's going on, and I thank you for the references you put in the chat. And I just want to say to everyone, if you enjoyed this, please share this video with your family and friends. We are always looking for new members, and and tell them about all the other YouTubes that videos that have been made in our true resource for our for not only CACOR members, but for everyone else who has access to them. So thank you very much, Vlad, for contributing to that.
Thank you, everyone.